Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. The show, as most of you know, brings you the libertarian perspective, the principled libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by the co-host of the Libertarian Angle, Richard Ebeling, who is professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you and to be joined by our viewers and listeners.
Yep, if you're new to FFF and this program, come and visit us at fff.org. We have 28 years of articles, conferences, videos, all sorts of good stuff that present libertarianism in a pure, uncompromising, principled fashion, including a monthly article by Richard Ebeling, who contributes to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, and, of course, this weekly show, The Libertarian Angle. Okay, Richard, burning issue of the day, April 15th, this week. We had Income Tax Day, the day that everyone is required to file their income tax returns and pay whatever income taxes they owe to the federal government. So let me make a few observations, and then I'll turn it over to you to get your perspective. In the 1950s, the great libertarian writer Frank Shutoff wrote this book called The Income Tax Root of All Evil. And it was a great book. And so I thought, well, that'll be our lead into the show. I'm not sure the income tax can be described as the root of all evil, but certainly it is the root of evil. I mean, this is what funds the welfare-warfare state. The welfare state, of course, being a system of mandatory charity, supposedly based on care and compassion for the poor, but it's all based on mandate. How can genuine charity and compassion and care for people be coming at the point of a gun, the coercion of the IRS and the Justice Department, who of course will come after you if you don't pay your taxes. They will come after you with liens, indictments, criminal prosecutions, sentencing, jail time, fines, and so forth. Not exactly a voluntary system as they often try to make it out to be. And then you've got the warfare state, or that's being run by the national security establishment. We've got these forever wars: Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Africa, the empire of military bases, both foreign and domestic, assassination program, regime change, coups, alliances with foreign dictators, foreign aid to dictators, as well as other regimes, especially ones that oppress their own citizenry and others. So you've got this massive welfare warfare state that is funded primarily through this root of evil, the income tax. Now, we've all grown up under this system, Richard. We've been born and raised on it and under it, and people honestly believe that this is freedom, because that's where the indoctrination comes in, especially in the government schools, which are partially funded by the IRS largesse, this tax-funded largesse. And so people have been indoctrinated with this notion that a free society necessarily presupposes an income tax, a graduated income tax, a welfare state, and a warfare state. Well, that would surprise, of course, our American ancestors who lived in the 19th century. For more than 100 years, America lived without an income tax. And, oh, by the way, they also lived without a welfare state. There was no mandatory charity. They also lived without a warfare state. There was no national security state, no Pentagon, no military-industrial complex, no CIA, no NSA, no FBI, and that's what they described as a free society. Now, they also had a government. I guarantee you there was a federal government from the time the Constitution called it into existence in the late 1700s all through the 1800s. There was a federal government. There simply was not a national security state. They had a limited government. And there was no welfare state. People were free to keep everything they earned and decide for themselves what to do with it. So the income tax really is the driving force, one of the driving forces, the primary driving force behind really the evil that the welfare state and the warfare state have brought to our country. It is a very tyrannical system. I don't know of any American that doesn't get at least a little bit concerned, if not totally terrified, when he gets a letter from the IRS and rightfully so. This is one of the most powerful tyrannical agencies in history. It can go out and seize property without due process of law, without suing people, impose liens on their property. If they don't pay, the IRS starts mounting interest and penalties and all sorts of things like that to induce cooperation. And like I said earlier, if you don't pay your taxes, they will come after you with a viciousness that defies credulity. So there's really only one solution to this. You see conservatives calling for tax reform, or Democrats calling for tax reform, maybe a little bit of minor tax reduction, but that's not making the case for a free society. Making the case for a free society involves calling for the dismantling, the repeal, the abolition of this horrific evil government program known as income taxation, which of course would abolish the IRS. It would be a way of life where you'd have no welfare state, no warfare state, a limited government republic. People would be free to keep everything they earn. They decide what to do with their money on charity, investment, savings, or whatever. And then, of course, you don't have all of these welfare state bureaucracies that suck a lot of the money out of people's pockets just to maintain their existence and perform the so-called service for us. That's the vision that we need to keep raising people's attention toward. Just as our ancestors raised people's vision toward principles like freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of the press, we've got to keep raising people's vision to the idea that a free society does not have income taxation. For that matter, I don't think it has any taxation, but clearly the founders were right to prefer indirect taxation to direct taxation because of the horrible tyrannical aspects of the IRS, as we've seen. So that's the free society. A society where people are free to keep everything they earn and where you don't and decide for themselves what to do with it, no income tax, and then no warfare state and all these forever wars. A society of limited government protecting people's rights, in which the American people are free to interact and travel and trade with the people of the world without the government coming down on them. What do you think?
Well, sort of let me elaborate and extend some of the argument that you've laid out. First, in 2018, the gross domestic product, the market value of all finished goods and services produced in the United States, the gross domestic product of the United States came in at approximately $19.5 trillion. In 2018, the federal government spent $4.1 trillion, which comes to about 21% of gross domestic product. Now, actually about 23% of gross domestic product. The government taxed about 21% of gross domestic product. The difference was, of course, the deficit. Now, the thing that needs to be kept in mind, and I'll get to the income tax in a minute, I really want to talk about tax take as a whole. If you realize that everything the government spends has to come through some taxes either now or in the future, that 4.1% did represent about 23% of GDP. And that's the number that often you hear bandied about. How much does the government take in taxes, either directly or reflected in its spending? But that ignores the fact that there are state and local governments as well. And in 2018, state and local governments spent an additional $3.1 trillion. Excuse me, $3.5 trillion. So if you add up what the federal government spent with the state and local governments, all levels of government combined spent about 40% of all of the productive wealth produced in the United States. But that's not the end of the story. There is a free market-oriented think tank in Washington, D.C. called the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And every year they put out a report on the cost of government business. Basically, what are the expenses for compliance with federal regulations, both doing it and then doing the paperwork to prove to the federal government that you did do it. And in their 2018 report, they estimated that compliance costs of all these types by private enterprise in the United States came to $1.9 trillion, almost $2 trillion. So now if you add up, and that's a tax on America as well, the cost of meeting government obligations, a burden that the government imposes that gets reflected in the prices of doing business, which consumers have to pay because the government has imposed this on the private sector. If you add up federal taxes, state and local taxes, and business compliance costs, then the government is siphoning off or burdening the people with almost 50% of the gross domestic product of the country. Now, let me use a benchmark of comparison. Go back to 2013, the year before the First World War began in Europe. In 2013, all levels of government, local, state, and federal, absorbed only approximately 8% of the national income of the United States. Another way of expressing that is that out of every dollar that an American earned, they kept 92 cents. Compare that to today, when if you view all of these tax burdens, either direct or indirect, of federal, state, and local and regulatory burdens, what the American people are able to keep free and clear, and that's not even counting everything, just the ones I've enumerated, Americans get to keep, after all of that, about 50 cents out of each dollar. Now, I asked the viewers and listeners the following, and I'm a professor, and I assure you this is not meant to be a trick question. You preferred to be in 1913 and keep 92 cents out of every dollar you earned, or you prefer to be in 2018 and keep 50 cents out of each dollar you earned? Another way of thinking about this. The Heritage Foundation on Monday, the 15th, did a little a picturegram, and they were pointing out when is Tax Freedom Day in the United States? And Tax Freedom Day relates to the fact, what do people earn and how much do they have to pay in various and sundry types of taxes to the federal government? And therefore, when have you stopped working for the government in terms of your average tax burden and start working for yourself for the rest of the year? And they estimated that Tax Freedom Day actually came on February 15th, 105 days into 2019. Before that, all that you earned during the year is the equivalent of what you were going to have to pay in taxes. However, they did point out that since the government also borrowed, and that represents taxes that have to be paid in the future, the real tax burden of Tax Freedom Day only is going to come on May 8th. That's when that would be the equivalent of all the government taxed and spent on borrowed money for this year. That's another indication of the burdensome of government. Now, when you have to work for another against your will, under the threat or the use of force, that has sometimes been referred to throughout history as slavery. Now, we are kinder and gentler. And rather than calling it slavery, it's paying your fair share for the common good and the salaries of those who sacrifice so much to be public servants for the nation as a whole. But the fact is, it doesn't change the fact that, as it's talked about in this idea of a Tax Freedom Day, for about the first 3.5 to 4 months of the year, that's the equivalent amount of time that you and I have to work just to basically pay our taxes to the federal government. That shows the degree to which we are unfree in America. Now, how did the government raise money before the income tax? As you said, there was a federal government. It operated obviously on a much smaller and narrower compass of duties and responsibilities, more in line with the traditional notions of constitutional responsibility. But they basically had three sources. One was excise taxes on what we would basically today consider sin taxes: alcohol, tobacco. They also had import duties, if you will, sales taxes on imported goods. Now, throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, there was a roller coaster. Are we having a sales tax just to generate revenue? Are we having a sales tax on foreign goods, the import of goods, import duties, as a protection against foreign competition to secure American industries? So it was a seesaw, free trade protectionism, free trade protectionism. But the fact is that whether it was more protectionist or more just revenue generating, for federal purposes. That was another source of revenue for the federal government. And then finally, land sales. As the America continent was being settled, farmed, cattle raising, resource development, the federal lands would be sold. And that was the third main source of federal revenues. But the fact is, that was it. Some excise taxes, some import duties, and land sales more than sufficiently covered all of the expenses of the federal government up to 1913, just a little over a century ago. Now, why was it sufficient for that? And by the way, I might mention, with a balanced budget at the federal level, a balanced budget. It's because government did not need more money because it was narrowly confined to those limited duties and responsibilities, even though government was growing in the American progressive era by today's standards. No welfare state, few, not none, but fewer regulatory agencies. Then just, and that's the following. You were saying is that Americans now take it for granted that so much is absorbed from their privately earned and honestly earned income as taxes. They don't really think of it as burdensome. Part of that is how it is taken. Before the Second World War, federal taxes were paid as a lump sum on April 15th. Only during the war, to have a constant stream of revenue to cover the federal government's war expenditures under Franklin Roosevelt, did they introduce withholding tax. By the way, that was suggested and developed in a memorandum by, one hates to have to say this, Milton Friedman, who then worked for the Treasury. But for which his wife Rose, according to him, never forgave him. She forgave a lot of things in his life, but to introduce withholding tax was something that she always held over his head as a serious no-no. But the fact is, once that was done, people come not even to think about it. Yeah, when you get a job, you're told what your salary is going to be, and maybe first with your tax, Social Security tax, Medicare, Medicaid tax, unemployment insurance, etc., and then state taxes. And you realize what a shockaroo it is to say this is what you're going home with in comparison to what you thought your gross salary was supposed to be. But after that, we become desensitized. And not only I have sometimes said that as a reform step towards abolishing the income tax, it should be made mandatory to pay income tax as an annual lump sum again. What is the total amount that the federal government is burdening you with? And it should be paid the Tuesday before the November elections. So you will have paid that lump sum from the federal government a week before you have to pull that lever. That'll get some people's attention to throwing the rascal out as an interim reform to waking people up to want to get rid of the damn thing. But this system works. Everyone taxing, and that makes it easier for them to undertake this siphoning off of the wealth of all the honestly working people of the United States.
Okay, let me say that you were blanking out sometimes in there, Richard, and I know we have a bad Skype connection for some reason, but I hope it came out clear in the recording. But if it didn't, I want to apologize to our viewers and listeners for those parts where it was difficult to understand, Richard. Richard, I think it's also important to remind people in this debate over socialism in America that the progressive income tax was part of the Communist Manifesto. You can see that online. The idea was that the rich have to pay more. And that's one of the driving forces behind this government program, this government tax, is envy and covetousness. It's not fair that some people have more when other people have less. And so what we need to do is equalize their wealth. Well, what ends up happening, of course, is what happens in Cuba and North Korea and other people that adopt this equalization mentality. Ultimately, everybody's equal because everybody's got nothing. And that's the ultimate ramification, the consequence of the system that you're referring to, where government's taking 50%. Now, there's the moral aspect of that, as you point out. This is just sheer slavery. I mean, you can have total slavery where the slave is required to devote 100% of his work efforts for someone else. Here you've got essentially, well, it's slavery, but to the extent of 50%, that you're required to work for someone else or other people, the federal government, for 50% of your life. It's still slavery. So there's that moral aspect. You can't reconcile slavery with freedom. And that's what we libertarians are about. We want a free society, which therefore necessarily means you keep everything you earn and you decide what to do with it. But there's also the economic consequences of what you're talking about. What does that mean that the government's taking at all levels 50% of people's earnings? Well, we're talking about significantly decreased standards of living. Why is that? Well, because as our ancestors showed, and as Adam Smith first pointed out in his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations in 1776, that rising standards of living come partly, and in a major part, through the accumulation of capital. That as people are accumulating wealth, they're keeping everything they earn, they're saving a part of that. And they put that savings in banks. And then the banks have it there available to be loaned out. So the employers of these people who are working in these businesses say, hey, look, I'm going to go borrow that money to buy a tractor. And so he goes and borrows the money and buys the tractor, owes the money to the bank, and now he brings the tractor home to the farm, and now the workers have a tractor instead of just hoes to harvest the crop and plant the crop. Productivity skyrockets, and therefore the revenues to the farmer increase. He now can go back and pay off his loan. He's got extra profits. This is what increases wage rates through the process of competition, because all the other farmers in the area are doing the same thing. So there's an increased demand for labor and the ability to pay higher wages through that competitive process. So there's this natural harmony that exists in a market economy that's raising people's standard of living. But that's coming about through capital accumulation that makes people more productive. More productivity increases standards of living, wealth for everybody in that society. This is what they destroy. They destroy freedom with their graduated income tax. They destroy higher standards of living. And of course, the other factor of higher standards of living is free trade. That when people are free to use the fruits of their earnings to trade with others, they're increasing their standard of living just through the process of trade, because they're giving up something they value less for something they value more. Well, here you've got a society now, Richard, which is waging trade wars. You got a president that's waging trade wars and imposing sanctions, embargoes, travel restrictions on Americans, going after people for that, at the same time as confiscating this massive amount of productive capital that not only destroys freedom, it destroys the ability of people to raise their standard of living.
Yeah, let's also remember that since in another couple of months we will be once more celebrating the Declaration of Independence, that what was it that the American colonies were objecting to? A handful of things, particularly if you read the enumerated grievances in the Declaration of Independence. And among the leading ones was government regulation and taxation, that is the British government's taxation and regulation. Concerning taxation, they had two complaints. A, that the British government, that is the Parliament, was attempting to impose taxes without the consent of the governed, taxation without representation. But while that was an important thing, they were adamant that it wasn't just that they didn't have representation in the imposition of taxes, but that the idea that the British government should be attempting to tax the people for things far beyond those which supposedly most enlightened people at that time were more or less in agreement about, the essential functions of government: police, courts, national defense, maybe a few little infrastructure projects which were taken for granted at that time. But basically that was it. And they were objecting both to the idea of taking without their consent and taking it for things that they considered to be illegitimate functions of the government, and a government that was 3,000 miles away from the citizens themselves. And the government regulations. the imposition of tariff duties, the restrictions on who the the American colonies could trade with, both inside and outside of the rest of the British Empire. So you had these American colonists who had a fraction of the tax burden that we have today, complaining about taxation without representation, what the government was spending upon, regulating their affairs. And they have a Boston Tea Party. They have embargoes against buying British goods with these stamp taxes, all to save what today would be something like 1 or 2% of the value of people's incomes, or the value of their goods as indirect taxes. Today, Americans accept a burden that would have been considered despotically oppressive to the Founding Fathers. And it is that change of understanding, attitude, and mentality which is part of the thing that we have to overcome. We must make our fellow Americans realize that the taking by government of any of this wealth, regardless of the rationales, if just we follow the constitutional premise that the government has functions A, B, and C, and that anything beyond that, no matter how rationalized, is unjustifiable in terms of protecting our liberty rather than violating them, until we can win our fellow citizens over to this understanding, it will continue, and economic as well as political despotism will remain as a threat to the country.
Yeah, and as a reflection of what you were saying, I mean, the Articles of Confederation, where they were operated under for 13 years, the federal government did not have the power to tax. Its powers were very weak. Now the state governments obviously did. But if you had told the American people that the Constitutional Convention was coming out with a proposal for a new federal government that had the power to tax incomes, that had the power to mandate charity, that had the power to wage undeclared wars and wars of aggression and coups, assassinations, and so forth, there is no possibility they ever would have approved the type of governmental system we have today. We'd still be operating under the Articles because they never would have approved the deal. So you're right, Richard. We've got to keep thinking in terms of what a genuinely free society is, because as you point out, all too many Americans believe that this is freedom. It's Johann Goethe's famous quote, "None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free." On that note, Richard, we've run out of time. Need to wrap it up. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for your great support. Come and see us at fff.org. And Richard, I'll see you next week.